All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, November 1914, William Monroe Trotter of Boston confronts President Woodrow Wilson in the Oval Office to demand that Wilson fulfills his duty to safeguard the liberty and dignity of all Americans, including and especially Black Americans. So, suffice to say, this is quite the moment, especially in this year of 1914. Really remarkable. A Black American standing up to the president during the heart of the Jim Crow era in the Oval Office. What drama? I don't think I need to sell it more than that, right? Let's just dive right in. Here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I want to paint the scene of that Oval Office confrontation, but one other scene to paint first is, 1914 in America, both the North and the South, Jim Crow America. What is the context? What is the larger sort of racial context for this moment?
I mean, this is what Rayford Logan calls the nadir, which he says it's one of the worst periods in American history for race, that race relations are off the charts. And a few more years, you're going to get Red Summer. You're going to get riots all across the country. And at this point in time, lynchings are about 2 people per week, which is astounding to think that every year, hundreds of people are being lynched all across the country, both in the North and in the South, primarily in the South, but all over the country. It's a huge problem. And so Trotter, he actually is a fan of Woodrow Wilson. He advocates for him. He believes that if he becomes into the presidency, that he might actually do something for African Americans. And so before, he takes this meeting, he's really trying to call Wilson to the carpet because he's like, hey, I stood up for you. I rooted for you. And now, you're not doing anything for African Americans. And so it's sort of a standoff in a bit of a way and at a crucial moment.
What was Trotter's hope for Wilson? What was that?
I think Trotter thought that Wilson was actually going to advocate for Black people and do more for Black people and move away from sort of a model of accommodationism that Booker T. Washington had pushed really hardcore. Booker T. Washington for a long time had been like the Black spokesman for all the presidents coming before, for Roosevelt and also for Taft. And so I think Trotter thought that Wilson would be this different president that might actually make some serious changes or fundamental changes, not just surface or symbolic.
And you could imagine why he might think that, because in the 1912 race, Wilson had been governor of New Jersey. He was running as a progressive, and what being a progressive meant was kind of open. And I think if you look at it from a slightly different perspective, Woodrow Wilson is also the first Southern president since the Civil War. And he brings those ideas of the lost cause and of the South to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., which was a place where for decades at that point, there was a burgeoning Black middle class because you had Black people who were serving in government jobs and had that kind kind of stability within the government, something that Woodrow Wilson would change upon taking office when he segregates the federal government.
Yeah, Woodrow Wilson might be coming from New Jersey, but he's very much a Southerner. You know, one of his friends in college was Thomas Dixon, who wrote The Klansman, which later becomes the Birth of a Nation film that we all sort of know and hate. But yeah, I mean, he was not at all, I think, what Trotter expected.
And funnily enough, I mean, Trotter, one of the things he does in his life of activism is he tries to shut down screenings of productions of The Klansman, which he does successfully, but then he's unable to shut down screenings of Birth of a Nation, by 1915. And, this is a moment in which it's just important to remember, like, Jim Crow is a northern and southern phenomenon, right? And it is not just the case. I mean, it is maybe more enshrined legally in the South, but in the North, it is absolutely the lived experience. The DC perspective, we talked about this in our episode about the riots in DC in 1919. But yeah, DC is an interesting moment there, and I think probably maybe makes Wilson even more of a kind of, this person betrayed this hope we had for him, because people thought that he would, living in a city that had a black middle class and had some black agency and overseeing government, which was one of the few places where civil service was one of the few places where it felt like black people could get jobs. And so if we're starting to paint the picture of the sort of betrayals that Trotter felt going into this confrontation, that's one of them, right? He segregates the army as well, right? Wilson.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the segregation, it sets back the black community, I would say generations, because you had not just black people who were able to gain employment, but they were able to have really good jobs that really helped to create a black middle class, particularly in Washington, D.C. D.C. at the time is about maybe a third black. 10% of the people living in D.C. are working for the federal government. These are qualified black people who all they have to do is pass their exams and they can get really desirable positions. These are not menial jobs, but these are jobs that carried a lot of respect in the community. And so when Wilson decides to segregate federal offices, it's not just the segregation that's the problem. It really keeps black people from attaining these jobs, from having, mobility within their position, moving up, having positions of authority, and having also wages that would have paid them more.
It was very clear to Black Washingtonians what the cost of the segregation was going to be. And so there is an immediate organizational reaction. The other thing about the 19-teens is it's this period where new national organizations for Black rights are emerging. So the National Urban League, the NAACP, and some of its predecessors. And so it's leaders of those organizations who are making contact with the White House in order to get those meetings. And Trotter, as a movement leader in the 19-teens, is one of those people who's able to secure meetings with the president.
And I suppose this is a chance to point out, that Trotter was a co-founder of the Niagara Movement, which is a precursor to the NAACP, and Trotter was very much kind of in the mix of this divide that's breaking out in this moment between the Du Bois wing and the Booker T. Washington accommodationist wing. And
he's much more radical, I think, than both of them. I mean, I think there's a story to be told about the divisions that are happening also in the Black community, because Trotter comes out as one of the first, opponents of Booker T. Washington, which is kind of a big deal because everyone sort of loved and supported Booker T. Washington. And even though W.E.B. Du Bois is in agreement with Trotter about his opposition to Washington, they can't get on the same page with their own agenda. And so after the Niagara movement ends, which is kind of a more radicalized version of the NAACP, it gets harder and harder to get these two men on board.
And this is something that is not uncommon in movements, especially when you have people who believe very passionately in the same goals, but have very, very, very different theories about how to go to it. And also people who are fervent believers in things can sometimes be challenging to get along with in social and professional situations. I think Trotter had a little bit of that attracted to him.
I know. This is all, shout out to Carrie Greenwich, who wrote the book, Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, because she talks about his personality a lot as being sort of a prickly person. You know, he was not always about decorum, and he would be a little bit brash with people. And I think, you know, this meeting that he has with Wilson, you get to see that full force. Wilson's sort of like, what?
well, let's go there. I mean, that's, you know, where I started in the intro, is this sort of showdown in the Oval Office, and that's what we're hooking this to. You know, it is interesting to me, this context that we're laying out of obviously this larger sense of we're moving backwards, you know, under Wilson, but also the specific question of civil service and jobs and all those things. And so when Trotter goes into this meeting, you know, my sense is he's not pulling out kind of like employment contracts and saying we need more jobs for Black Washingtonians. That's like around, but he's really going in to kind of make a forceful, well, tell us his kind of, you know, give us a sense of his vibe going into this.
I feel like I also want to give a little context. So Trotter's born in a well-to-do family. So he's not like Booker T, where he was born in slavery and has this, you know, sort of like from rags to riches story. He grows up very well-to-do. He's a Harvard alum. You know, he went there for graduate school and also postgraduate school. So he knows how to interact with the upper crust of society. But what I think is fascinating about Trotter is that he's very much for the everyday man. And so he's not just campaigning for Black workers or middle-class Black people. He really wants to elevate the race, the entire race. And I think that had he been pushing just an elitist agenda, he might have actually gotten more traction than the fact that he's really trying to say, no, these policies are wholesale bad for Black people.
And that it was humiliating and degrading.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That it wasn't just about economic loss, but that it was something that was harmful to people as people, which I think makes Wilson pretty defensive in response.
Yeah. So, I mean, Trotter, you know, some of the quotes from this meeting, the reporting from this meeting is that Trotter, again, talks about like your duty as our president and your obligation to colored American voters. We see segregation as humiliation and degradation, as you said, Niki. And then Wilson does this kind of classic thing, right? He gets defensive. Wilson, no kind of, you know, not a person you'd want to, no lovey-dovey figure himself, you know. But Wilson like comes out of it saying, "Oh, I didn't like his tone," right? Which is just the kind of thing you hear all the time, right?
Or I didn't like the fact that there was no deference with him. I think he, you know, he spoke to him sort of man to man, and Wilson's kind of like, but I'm the president like of the country, like, and he could not reconcile a Black man coming to him full of confidence, speaking with authority. That was just something he was not used to at all.
And literally kicks him out of the Oval Office, correct?
Yeah. He's like, you can go now. We're done here. We're done.
There's the door.
Yeah.
There's also something else that Wilson says at the meeting. He defends segregation, but he defends it saying that it actually prevents racial friction. And this is how you can reconcile Wilson's progressivism with his segregationism, which is that progressives pushed for segregation because they saw it as a way of preventing violence, that if you just kept Black people and white people apart, if you had a set of laws that would bring order to society, then everything would be fine. And, you know, they didn't actually care how Black people felt. They did not care about the humiliation and degradation, but they cared about that order. And that's the defense that Wilson makes of why things should be segregated.
I also think what's even more infuriating to Wilson is that once Trotter gets kicked out of the office, then Trotter goes right to the front lawn of the White House and holds a press conference. And he's like, and basically gives his whole take about what happened. And, you know, that does not bode well with Wilson at all. I think he wanted to be able to control and confine that conversation. And Trotter just put it out there for full transparency. And Trotter comes out looking sort of victorious with the press conference as well, because he's like, hey, I told him a thing or two. And even though he gets kicked out of the White House, you know, he still is like a person who stood his ground.
And it's important to note that Trotter was a newsman himself. He had started a newspaper called The Guardian as part of his activism. And so he understood the power of the press and knew coming out of that meeting that he had a way of controlling the narrative. And he did that pretty effectively.
Yeah, though a lot of the press narrative coming out of this, even in northern papers, I mean, southern papers, you can imagine what they wrote, right? But even northern papers wrote about kind of his insolence, and they quoted Wilson as saying, your tone offends me. And Wilson said, if this organization wants to speak with me again, they have to send another spokesperson, so, kind of shut it down. So, Trotter does not get another meeting there, obviously continues his life of activism. Anything you want to say about kind of his career and his legacy, either after this meeting or stuff we haven't talked about?
He still is a forceful civil rights leader. He still is someone that people greatly respected, especially in the Boston area. Trotter has this huge reputation. But it's sort of sad. Towards, the end of his life, he does face a lot of defeats. He has a lot of financial setbacks. There's a question about even his death, whether it was suicide or not. He falls from a building to his death. And it's kind of tragic in the way that a lot of Black civil rights leaders have these, major victories, but also lots of defeats. And I think we don't talk about how much those defeats sort of erode their consciousness.
There is this great story that still ties into the Wilson administration, which is at the end of World War I, when all of these countries are meeting to discuss human rights and democracy in Europe. Trotter and some other Black activists ask for permission to go to this meeting, and they're denied passports by the Wilson administration. And so Trotter sneaks on a ship and goes over there to make his case before the delegation for human rights and for Black rights in the U.S. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
So one of the little interesting coda to this is that the Woodrow Wilson Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, now has an award named after Trotter, which they instituted just last year. But that is quite amazing to think, and I wonder what Wilson would make of that. I wonder what Trotter would make of that.
I love
it. It's a pretty pointed decision.
I feel like it's a real rub. It's a real rub. Yeah. For those who know history, I think it's a real rub.
And I personally can't help but think this has to be thought of in the context of a lot of people questioning Wilson, and there was that whole thing about changing the school at Princeton that had his name on it, and a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests were sort of bringing up some questions about Wilson's racial legacy, and I wonder if this institute in D.C., they were like, well, we're not gonna change the name, but maybe we'll throw a little bone towards the racial activism. But,
I think that's a pretty safe bet.
Probably.
Yeah, I know. I would love to see Trotter's name on more and more things.
Yeah?
I would love to have him sort of have the prominence of Du Bois and a Booker T. I think people forget about Trotter.
Yeah. Well, there is a fantastic book by one of our favorite historians and writers, so people can go check that out. We'll put a link to Carrie's book in the show description for sure. All right, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.